What would you do? If saving your family meant selling your future, Charlotte Hale was only 24 when she signed a contract that would change everything, a marriage written in ink, built on rules, money, and silence. Across from her sat Ethan Cole, a cold, untouchable millionaire who believed love was just another liability. Two strangers, one deal, no emotions allowed. But what happens when the walls between them begin to crack? When the woman who sold her freedom discovers a man who's forgotten how to feel, and when the man who bought a lie finds a truth he can't afford to lose, from the glittering skyline of Manhattan to the quiet snowfall of Vermont. This is not just a love story. It's a story about redemption, courage, and the price of becoming human again. Because sometimes the heart signs what the hand cannot erase. Stay with us till the end, you won't forget it. If you believe love can rise from the ashes of a broken promise, hit, like, share, and subscribe, and let's begin The Millionaire Who Tore the Contract. The rain had been falling since morning, a steady whisper against the glass that made the city look half erased. Charlotte Hale stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Cole Tower penthouse, her reflection hovering between the gray clouds outside and the marble brightness within. She barely recognized the woman in the glass, 24 years old, pale from sleepless nights, hair pinned too carefully, wearing a silk blouse that still smelled faintly of the boutique where Ethan Cole's assistant had chosen it for her. Behind her, the conference table gleamed like ice. 2 folders lay open, each page thick with legal language she didn't truly understand. Beside them sat Ethan Cole, himself 34, posture straight as a line drawn by a ruler, a silver watch flashing when he moved his pen. His suit was charcoal, his tie a muted blue, his eyes unreadable. "Miss Hale," he said quietly, the way one might address a witness rather than a future spouse. "You've reviewed everything," Charlotte nodded, her throat tightened. "I have." The lawyer coughed discreetly. "Then all we need is your signature." Charlotte looked down at the final page. The words blurred for a moment, swimming with the reflection of city lights. Marriage contract? It still sounded absurd, colder than the rain, harder than the marble beneath her heels. $600,000 in exchange for 1 year of appearances, dinners, galas, charity events. A wife by title only. Her father's voice echoed faintly in memory, worn thin by hospital monitors. "Don't give up your life for me, Charlie." She had smiled through tears then. "It's just paperwork, Dad." Her hand trembled as she picked up the pen. The rain grew louder, somewhere below. A siren wailed and disappeared into the streets. She wrote her name, Charlotte Ann Hale, in careful loops. There was a click as the lawyer gathered the copies, his tone brisk, congratulatory. Ethan simply said, "Thank you. That will be all. Mr. Hughes." When the door closed, silence expanded like fog. Charlotte forced herself to meet Ethan's gaze. "So, what happens now?" He leaned back in his chair, unbuttoned his jacket. "Now, you move in. My assistant will handle the paperwork with the hospital tomorrow morning. Your father's bills will be paid in full within 48 hours. The words should have brought relief, but they felt like iron chains gently clasped around her wrists. "There are a few ground rules," he continued, voice level. "We'll attend events together as required. You'll have a separate suite. My staff will treat you as Mrs. Cole in public, and so will I." In private, he paused, eyes flicking briefly to her face. "I expect discretion, no interviews, no personal questions. This is a business arrangement, Miss Hale. Appearances only, no intimacy, no expectations beyond that." She swallowed hard. Understood. He studied her for a moment longer, as if searching for weakness or rebellion, then nodded once. "Good." Charlotte turned back toward the window, watching a drop of rain race another down the pane. "You must think I'm terrible," she said softly. Ethan's voice came from behind her, calm, almost curious. "Why would I think that? Because I'm selling myself." Another pause. Then, "We all sell parts of ourselves. Miss Hale, Some of us just get better contracts." The remark stung more than it should have, yet there was something underneath it, a weariness she hadn't expected. She wanted to ask what he'd sold of himself, but his expression had closed again. Shutters drawn, he stood, smoothing his tie. "Mrs. Lang, the housekeeper, will show you to your room when she arrives. The guest suite at the end of the hall is yours. Dinner is at 7, though I rarely eat at home." "Right?" She nodded, clutching her purse as though it might anchor her. Ethan hesitated by the door, hand resting on the frame. "Your father, he'll recover. I hope so. That's all any of us can do." Then he was gone, leaving only the echo of expensive shoes on marble and the faint scent of cedar cologne. Charlotte sank into the chair he had vacated. The contract folder remained open before her, one signature still damp with ink. "Appearances only." Outside, lightning flashed, throwing her reflection into relief, a small figure surrounded by too much space. For a moment, she imagined tearing the pages apart, running back to the hospital, confessing everything to her father. But then she pictured the tubes in his chest, the bills stacked in a neat, hopeless pile, and she folded the folder shut instead. The elevator chimed somewhere down the hall. Mrs. Lang's voice soft, efficient, carried through the penthouse. Charlotte rose, smoothing her blouse, composing the polite smile she would need to wear for a year. In the mirror by the door, she caught a final glimpse of herself, not the girl from Syracuse who waited tables through college, but the wife of Ethan Cole, tech visionary and silent fortress of a man. "Appearances only," she whispered. Her reflection didn't answer. The rain did. Long pause that night. As the storm pressed against the city, Charlotte lay awake in a bed that felt borrowed. The sheets smelled of starch and unfamiliar detergent. Somewhere beyond the wall, she heard the faint rhythm of typing, steady, relentless, the sound of a man keeping his world from collapsing. She turned toward the window and watched the skyline flicker with distant lightning. "This is for Dad," she told herself. "Just 1 year, 1 signature." Yet, as sleep crept closer, another thought slipped through the cracks of her resolve. What kind of man builds walls so high he has to hire someone to stand beside them? The question followed her into dreams, quiet as the rain. The elevator hummed softly as it rose toward the 48th floor. Charlotte's reflection stared back at her in the mirrored walls, too polished, too composed, a stranger in borrowed elegance. In her small hometown outside Syracuse, elevators were for hotels or hospitals. Here, they felt like gateways into another kind of atmosphere, thin, expensive air, scented faintly of orchids and quiet judgment. When the doors opened, the penthouse greeted her with silence. Not the comforting silence of home, but the kind that lived between marble and glass, sterile and deliberate. The living room stretched endlessly, white couches that looked untouched, a view of the Hudson River glittering in the afternoon sun, no photographs, no clutter, not a single trace of life. Charlotte set her suitcase down by the doorway and whispered to herself, "So, this is what money sounds like? Nothing?" A soft voice answered from behind. "It echoes if you let it." Charlotte turned. A woman stood there, gray hair pinned neatly, eyes bright despite her age. She wore a navy uniform, her hands folded calmly before her. "You must be Mrs. Lang," Charlotte said, grateful for a human voice. "Yes." "Dear? Welcome." The older woman smiled gently, the kind of smile that belonged to people who'd seen too much and judged little. "Mr. Cole mentioned you'd be staying with us for a while, for a year," Charlotte said before she could stop herself. "Mrs. Lang nodded as though she already knew. "Come, I'll show you your suite." They walked through hallways that gleamed with muted light. Each step echoed slightly, reminding Charlotte that she didn't belong here. The guest suite opened into another world of pale tones and expensive emptiness. A bed like a cloud, sheets tucked with military precision, windows that framed the skyline like art. "I'll make sure the cleaners don't come in without notice," Mrs. Lang said, smoothing the duvet with practiced hands. Mr. Cole prefers privacy. Does he ever talk? Charlotte asked softly. Mrs. Lang paused, eyes thoughtful. He speaks when something needs saying. He works too hard, sleeps too little, and pretends it doesn't matter. Then she gave Charlotte a small, knowing look. Eat something, even if he doesn't. That helps more than you think. Charlotte smiled faintly. Thank you. When Mrs. Lang left, the room felt too large again. Charlotte unpacked her single suitcase, 5 dresses, 3 pairs of shoes, a photo of her father smiling beside his diner, his apron covered in flour. She placed the picture on the nightstand. It looked almost out of place against the glass and chrome. Hours passed. The city shifted from daylight to amber dusk. She explored the apartment quietly, drawn to the open kitchen where rows of gleaming appliances waited unused. On the far counter, a tray of untouched mail sat beside Ethan's tablet and a neat pile of documents labeled Cole Innovations, Board Transition. She traced a finger along the edge of the counter, not a speck of dust, everything in its place, everything controlled. Footsteps broke the stillness. Ethan entered, phone pressed to his ear. His tie hung loose now, but his expression remained the same, focused, distant, a man mid-battle with invisible opponents. Yes, I've seen the numbers, he said sharply. If Benson wants control, he'll have to pay double. A pause. No, I don't care what the board thinks. They'll follow if I lead. He caught sight of Charlotte standing by the counter. Their eyes met briefly, her hesitant, his unreadable. He nodded once, like acknowledging a colleague, then continued down the hall toward his study. Dinner is in the warmer, he said without looking back. And then he was gone. Charlotte stood there for several moments, the faint murmur of his voice bleeding through the closed door of his office. She opened the warmer, perfectly plated salmon, roasted vegetables, lemon garnish untouched. She carried the plate to the dining table that could seat 12 and sat alone. The city glowed beneath her, 1,000 small lives flickering in windows far away. She picked at the food, not tasting anything. Later, she called the hospital. Her father's nurse told her the surgery date was confirmed. He's in good spirits, the nurse said. Talks about you all the time. Says his daughter's found something better in the city. Charlotte laughed softly, but her throat ached. Tell him I'll visit soon. When she hung up, she looked around the penthouse again, the expensive emptiness, the spotless counters, the silence thick as velvet. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the window glass. What price did I just put on myself? She tried to remember the warmth of her father's diner, the hiss of the griddle, the sound of old country songs on the radio, the way people called each other by name. Here, even the air felt labeled "Do Not Touch." Sometime after midnight, Charlotte wandered to the balcony. The rain had stopped. Below her, Manhattan pulsed with light and motion, a river of taxis and late-night diners. She could almost smell the coffee from street vendors, hear the laughter spilling from bars. But up here, everything was sealed away. Behind her, Ethan's office door was still closed, the thin glow of his computer screen spilling beneath it. She thought about knocking just to ask if he ever stopped working, if he ever felt lonely in this fortress of glass. But she knew better. He'd given her boundaries. Appearances only. She whispered into the night. You don't even see me, do you? No answer came, except for the wind brushing her hair. When she finally lay down, the bed felt too soft, the sheets too clean. She closed her eyes, and the city's heartbeat pulsed faintly through the walls. She saw her father again, smiling weakly from his hospital bed, his hand reaching for hers. Everything will be okay? Charlie, he'd said that morning before she left. You've always had a good heart. Don't let the world make you trade it. But maybe she already had. Her hand brushed the empty space beside her. The silence pressed down until she felt it in her chest. A small, almost bitter laugh escaped her lips. I sold a year of my life for a heartbeat of his. And yet, as exhaustion blurred her thoughts, she realized something unexpected beneath the emptiness of this place. There was a faint hum, not the machines, not the rain, It was possibility. The smallest chance that maybe behind those cold walls, something human still lived. The days began to blur together, each one folding neatly into the next, like pages of a book she didn't remember choosing. Ethan's world ran on a different clock. He left before the first trace of dawn and returned when the city was already asleep. Charlotte often woke to the faint hiss of the elevator at 5 a.m., followed by the soft click of the front door closing. By the time she rolled over, the penthouse would already feel like a museum, again, empty, polished, waiting for its owner to return. He lived in numbers and negotiations. She lived in borrowed silence. So, Charlotte decided she needed something of her own. The second-hand bookstore on Atlantic Avenue smelled like dust and paper, like memory itself. Its sign, Whitman's Nook, hung slightly crooked above the door. Inside, sunlight slanted through the blinds, cutting across shelves stacked to the ceiling. The owner, a tiny woman named Mrs. Whitman, paid barely enough for subway fare, but Charlotte didn't care. The moment she stepped inside, the noise in her head quieted. Here, the world was made of stories, the kind that didn't need contracts. Every morning she sorted new donations, wiping dust from covers, reading back blurbs as if reacquainting herself with old friends. Some books had inscriptions, "To my dearest. Merry Christmas." 1982. You once said this story was ours. Those faded notes felt more human than anything in the penthouse. Mrs. Whitman often teased, "You've got the soul of an old poet, dear. Don't let the city turn you into a machine." Charlotte smiled, brushing her hair from her eyes. "I'll try." When the day ended, she took the subway home, pressed between strangers, smelling of rain and exhaustion. Sometimes she imagined what Ethan was doing at that exact moment, perhaps seated in some boardroom with his suit jacket off, his eyes as cold and sharp as the city skyline. She wondered if he ever noticed the time he spent alone. Back at the penthouse, the contrast always jarred her. The marble floors gleamed like ice, the furniture untouched since morning. The only sign of life came from a single sheet of paper resting on the kitchen counter, written in elegant cursive soup in the fridge. "Dear, don't forget to warm it, Mrs. Lang." The notes appeared every few days, little slips of care that reminded Charlotte someone still noticed her existence. She kept them tucked between pages of her books, like pressed flowers. Once, she found a small bouquet of fresh daisies in a glass by the sink. No note that time, just a quiet kindness, left behind, one night around 11. She sat curled on the living room sofa, reading by the pool of warm lamplight. A paperback rested on her knees, The Great Gatsby, worn and underlined by some stranger long ago. She traced the words, whispering softly, "So we beat on, boats against the current." A faint sound broke her focus. Footsteps. Ethan had returned. Charlotte looked up just as he stepped into the room. Jacket slung over one arm, tie loosened. He froze when he saw her there, barefoot, hair loose, eyes half lost in the pages. For a brief, flickering moment, he didn't look like the man from the magazines, the tech mogul, the controlled negotiator. He looked startled. "I didn't realize you were still awake," he said quietly. Charlotte marked her page. "I couldn't sleep." He nodded, gaze flicking toward the book. "What are you reading, Fitzgerald?" she replied. "The ending always feels sad, even when you know it's coming." Something shifted in his face, some emotion too quick to name. "Sad endings are inevitable," he said finally. "Only if people stop trying," she murmured. For a heartbeat, they stood there, two silhouettes in golden light, the city humming softly beyond the glass. Then Ethan's phone buzzed. The moment vanished. He checked the screen, his expression hardening again. "Good night, Charlotte." "Good night," she answered, voice barely audible. The sound of his footsteps faded down the hall. When he was gone, Charlotte exhaled slowly. Her heart had no reason to be racing, but it was. She stared at the page she'd been reading, the words blurring. Somewhere in that quiet, something inside her had begun to move. Over the next few weeks, their routines continued like clockwork. Ethan's presence existed mostly in traces. A coffee cup left half full on the counter. A jacket draped across a chair. The faint echo of his voice through the office door. She never dared interrupt. Yet, sometimes, she caught glimpses of the man beneath the armor. Once, she heard him pacing his study, his tone sharp over the phone. "You can't replace loyalty with profit," he said. "That's not leadership." The next morning, his tie hung crooked, eyes red-rimmed, as if he hadn't slept at all. Charlotte thought of saying something. "Are you okay?" But she bit her tongue. "Appearances only. Still." "Mrs. Lang noticed. He's not a cruel man," the housekeeper said one afternoon while folding linens. "Just a lonely one who forgot how to admit it." Charlotte frowned. How does someone forget loneliness? "Mrs. Lang smiled sadly. "By pretending it's power." The words stayed with her long after the older woman left. Friday evening, the rain returned. Charlotte came home late, soaked from the knees down. She kicked off her shoes at the door, laughing quietly at the mess she'd made on the perfect marble floor. The laughter felt out of place, but alive. In the reflection of the window, she saw Ethan standing in the hallway, still in his suit, watching her with that same unreadable expression. For a second, he looked like he might say something, but then he turned away, vanishing into his office again. Charlotte whispered to the empty air, "Ghosts in the hallway." The phrase fit. This house was full of them, echoes of words unspoken, of hearts that had forgotten how to reach each other. That night, she made herself tea, turned off the bright lights, and left only the small lamp by the sofa. The city shimmered outside like a restless ocean. She picked up her book again, but the words refused to stay still. Instead, she found herself wondering whether Ethan had ever read novels at all, or if he'd once loved something beyond numbers and power. For the first time, she wanted to know the story behind the man who had bought her silence. And that desire, fragile and dangerous, was the beginning of everything that would follow. The invitation had been printed on cream cardstock so thick it could have doubled as armor. Gold script curled elegantly across the top. The Margaret Cole Foundation, annual winter fundraiser. Charlotte read it 3 times before setting it down beside her morning tea. The idea of walking into Ethan's mother's world filled her with equal parts dread and disbelief. When Ethan finally mentioned it over breakfast, his first breakfast at home in weeks, he was matter of fact. "My mother insists on appearances," he said, scrolling through his phone. "We'll leave at 6. Formal attire." Charlotte nodded, unsure what else to say. "I'll make sure I look the part." His eyes lifted briefly, pausing on her face. "You always do." Then the phone rang, and the moment passed like it had never existed. By late afternoon, the penthouse had transformed into a dressing room, garment bags draped across the bed, jewelry boxes opened like small treasure chests. Mrs. Lang fluttered around, pinning fabric and murmuring small reassurances. Charlotte stood before the mirror, wearing a dark green gown that shimmered softly under the light. It felt heavy, elegant, far removed from her worn bookstore sweaters. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Lang said, fastening the final clasp at her shoulder. "Don't let them see your nerves. They can smell fear. Those people." Charlotte smiled faintly. "I'll keep that in mind." When Ethan appeared in the doorway, tuxedo crisp, cufflinks catching the light. For a heartbeat, she forgot how to breathe. He stopped mid-step, eyes flickering over her. "You clean up well," he said quietly. "So do you." They stared a little too long, both pretending not to notice. Then he offered his arm, businesslike, ready as I'll ever be. The Cole estate in Connecticut was everything she'd imagined and more: manicured lawns, marble fountains, a ballroom glowing with chandeliers. Laughter echoed off the high ceilings, accompanied by the clinking of champagne glasses. Photographers waited near the entrance, flashes bursting like tiny explosions. "Smile," Ethan murmured through his teeth as they stepped forward. His hand rested lightly at the small of her back, a gesture rehearsed, but steady. She smiled, though her stomach twisted. Inside, the air smelled of perfume and power. A string quartet played near the staircase. Waiters moved gracefully through the crowd with silver trays. Ethan, a voice called. A tall man with silver hair and a glass of brandy approached, his grin too wide. There you are, and this must be the new Mrs. Cole. Charlotte extended her hand politely. It's lovely to meet you. The pleasure's mine, he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Ethan's been keeping you hidden, hasn't he? I suppose one must protect rare finds. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Charlotte prefers her privacy. The man's gaze flicked over her dress, lingering just a beat too long. A small-town girl in the big leagues. Must be quite the adjustment. Charlotte's smile faltered. It's different. Yes, different, the man repeated, smirking. Well, enjoy it while it lasts. He laughed, already turning toward another guest. She felt heat rise in her face. The laughter around them blurred, becoming background noise. For a moment, she wanted to vanish to sink through the polished floor and escape. But, before she could move, Ethan's voice cut through the chatter, low, firm, unmistakably sharp. My wife's work matters. Richard. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Conversations nearby faltered. Richard blinked, clearly not expecting to be called out. Ethan's expression was calm, but his tone carried a warning. She manages one of the oldest bookstores in Brooklyn. She helps people find stories that remind them why they're still human. You might try reading one. Richard's smirk vanished. He muttered something about drinks and hurried off. Charlotte stood frozen, unsure what had just happened. When she finally looked at Ethan, he was already steering her toward another group, his face unreadable once more. But his hand stayed on her back, firm and protective. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. She smiled when required, nodded at introductions, endured the curious glances from women dripping in diamonds. Yet, somewhere between the toasts and the music, she realized Ethan hadn't left her side once. Margaret Cole appeared near the end of dinner, radiant in navy blue, her posture a masterclass in command. Her gray eyes swept over her son and landed on Charlotte with clinical precision. So, this is the woman who finally got Ethan to attend my events, she said. Charlotte extended a hand. Mrs. Cole, thank you for inviting me. Margaret, please. The older woman's handshake was cool but not unkind. I must say, you handle the crowd well. Most newcomers drown in it. Charlotte smiled. I learned to swim young. Margaret's eyebrow lifted amused, maybe impressed. Good. You'll need that spirit if you're staying in this family. Before Charlotte could reply, Ethan's phone buzzed. He stepped away to take the call, leaving the two women facing each other amid the hum of conversation. Margaret leaned slightly closer. He's a difficult man, my son, always has been. But you make him look alive again. Keep doing that. Charlotte blinked. I'm not sure Of course you do, Margaret interrupted softly. A mother can tell. Then she smiled, the kind that carried more weight than warmth, and drifted away to greet another guest. The drive home was quiet. Rain had started again, tapping softly against the windshield. Charlotte watched droplets chase each other down the glass, thinking of Ethan's voice in the ballroom, steady, protective, almost tender. Finally, she said, you didn't have to defend me. He kept his eyes on the road. Yes, I did. Why? He hesitated, the muscles in his jaw flexing. Because he was wrong. Charlotte studied his profile in the passing streetlight, the clean line of his jaw, the faint shadow beneath his eyes. For once, he didn't look invincible. He looked tired, human. She smiled faintly. Thank you. Ethan? He nodded, but didn't answer. As they crossed the bridge back into the city, Charlotte turned her gaze toward the skyline, its lights shimmering like distant constellations. Somewhere in that quiet stretch of road, The distance between them began to shrink just slightly, just enough for her to feel it, and for Ethan, who had built his entire life around walls and control, that was the first small crack in the ice. The penthouse was wrapped in darkness. Only the steady hum of the refrigerator and the soft whisper of the city far below broke the stillness. Charlotte woke suddenly, uncertain why. The digital clock beside her read 2:03 a. Her dreams had been strange, half memories of the gala, half flashes of her father's laugh. Sleep refused to return. She slipped from the bed, pulling on a light sweater, and padded barefoot into the hallway. The marble floor was cool against her feet. A faint light glowed from the kitchen, the kind that belonged to someone who couldn't quite face the dark. Ethan was there. He stood at the counter in shirt sleeves, his tie draped loosely around his neck, the top button undone. A bottle of whiskey sat open beside a single glass, still full. He wasn't drinking, just staring at the amber liquid as if it held an answer he couldn't reach. Charlotte hesitated in the doorway. Couldn't sleep either. He looked up, startled, then gave a short nod. Something like that. She stepped closer, careful not to startle him. The city lights from the windows painted his face in sharp angles. Handsome, yes, but tired in a way that went deeper than work. "Do you always think with the lights off?" she asked lightly. His lips twitched, almost a smile. "Helps me hear myself think." "Dangerous habit," she said. "You might start listening." That earned her a real look, a flicker of curiosity behind his guarded expression. "You like to talk in riddles, don't you?" "Only when it's quiet enough for someone to hear them." He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Silence doesn't bother you?" "It used to," she said, folding her hands around the edge of the marble. "When I first moved in here, it felt like the walls were swallowing sound. Back home, you could hear everything: neighbors arguing, someone's dog barking, the wind in the trees. Here, it's too clean, too quiet." Ethan studied her. "Most people would call that peace." "Peace isn't the same as emptiness," she replied softly. "You can't fill your life with silence and expect it to keep you company." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city pulsed faintly beyond the glass-red lights, flickering like a heartbeat. Ethan finally said, "Noise can be dangerous too." Charlotte tilted her head. "How so?" "It gets inside your head. Crowds, opinions, demands. Everyone wanting something. Eventually, you stop hearing anything real. You start craving the quiet, even if it means being alone." His tone had changed, lower, quieter. She could almost hear the fatigue beneath it, the years of holding himself together. "You don't have to be stoned to be strong." "Ethan." The words slipped out before she could stop them. He blinked, caught off guard. "What you heard me." Her voice stayed gentle, not challenging, just true. "You build walls to protect yourself, but maybe they're the reason you're drowning." He looked away, jaw tightening. "Don't start imagining there's more here than there is. You signed that contract with open eyes." "I did." She smiled, sad and steady. "And yet, here we are, talking about walls and drowning at 2 a.m. His eyes flicked to hers, sharp again. "Don't read meaning into this arrangement. Too late." The silence that followed was thick, alive. The air between them seemed to hum. Ethan exhaled slowly, turning the untouched glass in his hand. "You shouldn't mistake civility for connection. Maybe I'm just mistaking humanity for possibility," she said, her tone quiet but unwavering. He looked at her, then really looked. For the first time, she saw the exhaustion behind the control, the man who carried his success like armor because he'd forgotten how to exist without it. Her calm unsettled him. There was something in the way she stood there barefoot, hair loose, eyes clear and kind, that made his chest tighten in a way he didn't understand. Why does her calm feel dangerous? Ethan cleared his throat. "Breaking the moment? You should get some rest. Tomorrow's another long day. For you, maybe," she said. Mine will be simple books and customers who still believe in stories. Stories don't pay hospital bills. No, she admitted, but they keep people alive long enough to find a way to. Her words lingered, quiet but sure. She turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. "Good night, Ethan?" He didn't answer. He only watched as she disappeared down the hall, the soft pad of her footsteps fading into silence. When she was gone, he poured the whiskey back into the bottle and set the glass aside. He didn't know why he'd done it. He rarely wasted anything. But suddenly, the idea of drinking alone in this hollow space felt pathetic. He walked to the window, staring down at the endless city. It looked alive, but distant, like a world that no longer belonged to him. He thought of her words. "You don't have to be stoned to be strong." Ridiculous. Strength was what had built everything he owned. Strength had kept him standing when everyone else fell. And yet, her voice had slipped beneath his defenses like water finding a crack in stone. He could still see her there, the way she'd leaned against the counter, unafraid, the soft certainty in her voice. He pressed his palms to the glass, the cold seeping into his skin. Somewhere deep inside, a memory stirred his father's voice, rough from too many sleepless nights. "Son, you can't build an empire out of silence. It'll collapse on you." Ethan closed his eyes. "Too late for that," he murmured, but even as he said it, he wasn't sure anymore. Down the hall, Charlotte lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The conversation replayed in her mind, every word sharp and bright. She hadn't meant to challenge him. It just happened. For the first time, she'd seen a glimpse of the man behind the fortress, and it scared her how much she wanted to see more. She turned on her side, pulling the blanket closer. The city's hum was faint through the glass, like the sound of distant breathing. Maybe silence wasn't the enemy after all. Maybe it was the space where truth began to echo. She closed her eyes, whispering to herself, "Too late," and somewhere in another room. Ethan Cole sat in the half-light, wondering when the quiet had stopped feeling safe. Morning crept into the penthouse like a hesitant guest. Soft light filtered through the tall windows, painting long stripes across the floor. The air smelled faintly of rain and something freshly brewed coffee. Maybe. Charlotte rubbed her eyes, still drowsy from the night before. For a few blissful seconds, she forgot where she was until her gaze landed on the gleaming skyline beyond the glass. Manhattan, bold and indifferent, stared back. She slipped from bed, wrapped herself in a sweater, and padded into the kitchen. The counters gleamed like mirrors, untouched as always, but something new waited there. An envelope, cream-colored, her name written across the front in sharp, deliberate handwriting. Charlotte. The letters were unmistakable. Ethan's. She hesitated before touching it, half afraid it might vanish. Then, with trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside lay a single credit card and a note written in the same precise script. "For your bookstore. Consider it an investment." That was all. No greeting, no signature, but it was enough. Charlotte sank onto one of the bar stools, the paper fluttering slightly in her hand. The room blurred at the edges, her breath catching as she read it again and again. "For your bookstore." He'd noticed. She covered her mouth with one hand, blinking hard as tears welled. He had paid attention to her, to the one part of her life that still felt real, still belonged entirely to her. The emotion came quietly, like a wave lapping the shore, not a sob, not dramatic, just the silent overflow of someone who hadn't expected kindness and didn't know what to do with it. She folded the note carefully, pressing it flat against her chest, just above her heart. The cool paper warmed under her touch. For reasons she couldn't explain, it felt like something sacred, fragile proof that the walls between them weren't impenetrable after all. Charlotte placed the card back in the envelope, smoothing it reverently. Then, without really thinking, she slipped it into the back pocket of her worn denim jacket, the one she always wore to the bookstore. It didn't matter that it was just money. It wasn't the card itself that moved her. It was the gesture quiet, thoughtful, unannounced, a small break in the silence. From the balcony above, Ethan stood in the morning light, coffee cup in hand, pretending to read the financial section on his tablet. He wasn't reading. Through the glass, he could see her sitting at the counter, her shoulders shaking slightly as she pressed the note to her chest. The sight did something to him that he didn't have words for. He had left the envelope there impulsively, almost carelessly. He'd justified it to himself as business logic, a simple investment in a store that clearly mattered to her, something to ease his conscience after their midnight conversation. Nothing personal. At least, that's what he told himself. But now, watching her reaction the way she cradled the note like a fragile secret, he felt a tightening in his throat that had nothing to do with guilt. She's crying, he thought. God! Why is she crying? He looked away, gripping the edge of the balcony rail. This was exactly the kind of thing he avoided: messy, human, unpredictable, the sort of feeling that didn't fit neatly on a balance sheet. Still, a small voice inside him whispered something traitorous. You wanted her to feel seen. He crushed the thought immediately. Down below, Charlotte wiped her tears and drew a deep breath. The city outside was alive, taxis honking, sirens wailing, sunlight bouncing off distant windows, but in here, everything was still. She whispered to no one. Thank you. The words floated up toward the glass ceiling, unheard but real. She poured herself coffee, though her hands still trembled. The steam curled upward, carrying the faint scent of warmth through the cold kitchen. For the first time since moving into this place, it didn't feel entirely empty. She sat there a while longer, reading the note again, memorizing every stroke of his handwriting. Then she folded it into a neat square and tucked it safely in her pocket. It wasn't just paper. It was proof of something shifting, something almost invisible, but alive. Later that morning, as Ethan prepared to leave for his meetings, Charlotte passed him in the hallway. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment. She wanted to say thank you, to tell him that his small gesture had reached deeper than he could know. But his expression was its usual calm, controlled, unreadable. He adjusted his cufflinks and said simply, "Don't forget your jacket. It's chilly out." It was nothing ordinary words, polite, distant, and yet, for Charlotte, it was everything. She smiled faintly. I won't. As the elevator doors closed behind him, she touched the folded note in her pocket again. At the bookstore, the day passed quietly. Sunlight drifted across the floorboards, dust motes dancing like tiny stars. Between customers, she pulled out the note and read it once more, tracing the words with her fingertip. Mrs. Whitman noticed. Of course. You look lighter today. Dear, the older woman said while shelving a stack of biographies. Charlotte smiled. Maybe I just remembered something good. Hold on to that. Mrs. Whitman replied. In this city, good things can slip away if you blink. Charlotte nodded, folding the paper back into her jacket pocket. She didn't intend to blink. Not this time. That night, when she returned home, the penthouse felt different, softer somehow. The silence no longer pressed against her. She made tea, changed into her favorite sweater, and sat by the window overlooking the city. She held the note in her hands one last time before slipping it into her journal between pages filled with bookstore sketches, memories, and letters she'd never sent. Then, on impulse, she whispered, "For your bookstore." The words carried warmth even in the still air. From that moment, the note became her secret charm, her quiet reminder that beneath Ethan Cole's armor of ambition, something human still beat faintly, something that might one day reach back. The storm rolled in just after dusk, thick gray clouds smothering the skyline, lightning slicing the horizon like anger made visible. By the time Charlotte left the bookstore, the rain had turned into a relentless curtain, cold and heavy. The subway lights flickered, trains delayed by flooding, and the city, that great unstoppable machine, began to choke on its own momentum. By the time she reached the penthouse, hours later, her clothes clung to her like ice. Her shoes squished with every step. Her fingers were so numb, she could barely fit the key into the lock. The door finally opened with a soft click. Inside, warm light spilled across the marble floors and voices. Or, rather, one voice. Ethan's. He was home. Early. He stood in the living room, tie loosened, phone pressed to his ear. His tone was clipped, furious, each word sharp as glass. "I don't care what the board thinks. Daniel," he said, pacing the room like a caged animal. "If they want to profit from exploitation, they can do it without my name attached. I'm done." A pause. Lightning flashed outside. His voice dropped lower, colder. "Then tell them to find another puppet. I built this company to make something, not destroy people for numbers." He ended the call abruptly. The silence that followed was thick, humming with leftover anger. Then he turned and froze. Charlotte stood in the doorway, soaked through, hair plastered to her cheeks, her lips trembling from cold. "Charlotte," he breathed, all the fire draining from his expression. "What happened?" "Subway delays," she managed, voice weak. "I'm fine. Just..." But the word died in her throat. The room tilted slightly, her vision narrowing to a blur of light and shadow. She staggered, grabbing the edge of the console table. In 2 strides, Ethan was there. Hey, easy," he said, catching her just before she fell. Her skin felt like ice beneath his hands. "You're shaking." "I'm okay," she tried to insist, but her voice sounded far away. "Just cold." Ethan didn't argue. His instincts overrode logic. He scooped her into his arms effortlessly, her damp clothes soaking through his shirt. She tried to protest. "You don't have to stop talking," he said, voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. "You're freezing." The bathroom filled quickly with steam as he turned on the shower, testing the water with his wrist until it was warm enough. He set her down carefully on the counter. "Get under the hot water," he said, meeting her eyes. "Now?" Charlotte blinked at him, dazed. "Mrs. Lang isn't here." "I know," he said. "I'll figure it out." He turned toward the door, hesitating. "Can you manage?" Her cheeks flushed, whether from fever or embarrassment she couldn't tell. "I can manage." He nodded once and stepped out, closing the door behind him. 20 minutes later, wrapped in a thick robe, her hair still damp, Charlotte walked into the kitchen. The air smelled warm, comforting. She stopped short. Ethan stood at the stove, sleeves rolled up, tie abandoned, stirring something in a pot. Steam rose around him. A small loaf of bread rested on a cutting board, butter melting slowly on top. "You cook?" she asked, incredulous. He glanced over his shoulder. For once, his expression wasn't guarded, just faintly amused. "I used to, before money made me forget simple things." Charlotte smiled faintly, sinking onto a stool. "Simple things are the hardest to remember." "Apparently," he said. He ladled soup into a bowl and placed it before her. The scent of chicken and herbs filled the air. She didn't realize how hungry she was until the first spoonful. Warmth spread through her chest, chasing away the ache in her bones. Ethan leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her. What she said between bites? Nothing. He looked away, just making sure you're really okay. "I will be," she said softly. "It's just been a long day." He nodded. The storm outside growled again, rattling the windows. For a while, they sat in companionable silence, the first real quiet that didn't feel empty. Charlotte set down her spoon. "You were angry earlier, about the call." Ethan exhaled through his nose. A merger proposal, profitable, but unethical. They wanted to cut corners that would hurt employees. "I said no, because it's wrong," she said simply. He met her gaze, surprised. "Most people would have said, because it's bad business." "I'm not most people." "No," he said quietly. "You're not." Their eyes held for a moment too long, the kind of stillness that hums with something unspoken. Charlotte looked down, tracing the rim of the bowl with her fingertip. You don't have to keep pretending you're made of steel. Ethan? He smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. It's better than breaking. Sometimes breaking is what lets the light in, she said, echoing something her father once told her. He said nothing, just watched her that calm strength, that softness he couldn't categorize. Why does her calm feel dangerous? The question returned, uninvited. He turned toward the sink, rinsing the ladle just to do something with his hands. You should rest. I will, she said, standing slowly. Thank you. For the soup? You're welcome, he said, his voice softer now. When she walked past him, he caught the faint scent of rain and lavender. It lingered even after she disappeared down the hall. Ethan stayed in the kitchen long after she was gone, the half-empty bowl still on the counter, her untouched slice of bread beside it. He poured himself a glass of water, staring out the window at the storm. Rain streaked down the glass, distorting the city lights below. He thought about the woman sleeping down the hall, the one who worked in a dusty bookstore, even though she could have anything she wanted, who saw him not as a brand or a billionaire, but as someone still capable of being human. The realization unsettled him, because for the first time in years, he wanted to be that man again. Down the hall, Charlotte lay in bed, warmth finally seeping back into her body. The storm still raged outside, but she felt oddly safe. She could still see Ethan in her mind, sleeves rolled up, stirring soup, his voice soft but steady. It was a strange image, the man who ruled boardrooms standing barefoot in a kitchen, saving her from a cold he didn't cause. She smiled faintly, whispering to the dark. Maybe he hasn't forgotten everything simple. Lightning flashed, illuminating her reflection in the window. The note in her jacket pocket caught the light for an instant. For your bookstore. It felt like a connection forming, fragile but real. And though she didn't know it yet, that night that small act of care was the beginning of everything neither of them dared to name. The storm had passed, leaving behind the soft quiet that follows survival. The air felt cleaner, thinner, touched with that faint metallic scent, rain leaves on steel and glass. Charlotte woke late, feeling lighter, though her body still ached. The penthouse was unusually alive. Faint music drifted from the kitchen. Something instrumental, calm. When she entered, Ethan was there, in shirt sleeves again, sleeves rolled and collar open. He was setting 2 plates on the counter, roasted chicken, vegetables, a bottle of white wine breathing beside them. You didn't have to, she began. I did, he interrupted, almost awkwardly. You looked like you could use a real meal. It was the closest thing to kindness she'd ever heard from him. She smiled faintly. What's the occasion? Ethan hesitated. Let's call it a truce. Between whatever this is and what it was supposed to be. Charlotte tilted her head. And what is it supposed to be? He didn't answer. Instead, he gestured to the table. Sit. Eat before it gets cold. They ate quietly at first, the clink of silverware echoing softly in the vast room. Outside, the city lights shimmered like distant constellations. After a while, Charlotte set down her fork. Can I ask you something? Ethan nodded. You usually do. Why do you work the way you do? She asked. You already have everything. Money, success, reputation. What's left to prove? He leaned back, folding his napkin slowly. You assume it's about proving something. Isn't it? Ethan's eyes darkened. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. But then he spoke, his voice quieter, stripped of its usual confidence. When I was 26, he began, my father lost everything. The company he built, the house, the friends who smiled in his face. It was all gone within weeks. There were lawsuits, accusations, news stories that called him a fraud. None of them knew the truth he didn't steal. He just trusted the wrong people. Charlotte listened, still, barely breathing. He couldn't live with it. Ethan continued. One morning, he just didn't wake up. The words hung in the air like smoke. Charlotte's throat tightened. I'm so sorry. He gave a humorless smile. After that, I made a promise that I'd never depend on anyone again, that no one would ever have the power to destroy me. She studied him for a long moment. So you built walls. I built empires, he corrected softly. Same thing? A faint, bitter laugh escaped him. The funny part is, when you win like that, people call it strength, but it's just fear wearing a better suit. Charlotte's eyes softened. Fear doesn't make you weak. Ethan, pretending you don't have it, does. He met her gaze, and for once, didn't look away. The tension in his shoulders eased just slightly. You're not afraid of much. Are you? He asked. I am, she said. I'm afraid of forgetting who I am. He frowned. What do you mean? Charlotte toyed with the edge of her napkin, choosing her words carefully. Working at the bookstore keeps me grounded. It reminds me there's still something simple and real in my life. Here. Everything feels like it belongs to someone else. The walls, the clothes, even my reflection in the mirror. But when I'm among books, I know myself. Ethan studied her quietly. Like she was a riddle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. Most people would have quit the moment the check cleared, he said. I'm not most people, she replied with a soft smile. He smirked faintly. I'm beginning to realize that dinner faded into conversation, not the small talk of polite strangers, but something deeper, a slow unearthing. They talked about her father's recovery, her childhood summers at the lake, his first startup that nearly failed before it succeeded, the kind of things people shared when they stopped guarding themselves. And then, between the pauses, came the question Ethan hadn't expected to ask. You've never mentioned anyone from before. Before, she echoed, anyone serious, someone you cared about. Charlotte hesitated. Then she laughed softly, almost embarrassed. That's because there wasn't anyone. He blinked. You're joking. No. She shook her head. I've never been in love, never even been kissed properly. For a moment, he thought he'd misheard. Not once, she said, smiling faintly at his expression. Guess I never met the right person. Silence stretched between them, long, heavy, delicate. The city outside seemed to fade away. Only the soft hum of the lights and the distant sound of rain filled the space. Ethan's gaze lowered to her hands resting on the table. Fingers intertwined nervously. Something shifted in him, then something he hadn't felt in years. She's untouched, he thought, not in the naive sense, but in the way someone remains unspoiled by cynicism, by transaction, by all the things money corrodes. He leaned forward, his voice low. Then everything we signed means nothing now. Charlotte froze, her breath catching. He wasn't talking about the contract, not really. She could feel it in his tone, in the way his words trembled slightly as if he'd stepped past his own defenses without meaning to. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Only the pounding of her heartbeat, a sound the TTS voice would almost pause for. Suspended in air, a beat, then another. Ethan's hand twitched as though he wanted to reach for her, but didn't. Charlotte whispered, Then what does it mean? Ethan, his gaze softened, but his answer was quiet. It means, I don't know anymore. For a while, they just sat there, two people who had built their lives around control, now adrift in something that didn't obey any rules at all. Charlotte finally rose to clear the dishes, needing to move, to breathe. He stood too, taking one from her hands. Their fingers brushed brief, electric. Both froze. Her voice was barely a whisper. You don't have to be alone in everything. You know. He swallowed hard. Maybe I don't know how not to be. Then maybe that's what you're supposed to learn, she said gently. He wanted to say something to tell her she was right, to admit that she'd already started teaching him without trying, but words failed. Instead, he simply said, Good night, Charlotte. She smiled softly. Good night, Ethan. When she turned away, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Later, as he stood on the balcony, wind tugging at his shirt, he replayed her words, never been in love, never been kissed properly. Something inside him cracked, subtle but irreversible. He had built a life from steel and silence, and yet, with one confession over dinner, Charlotte Hale had reminded him what it meant to feel again. The night was supposed to end in champagne and polite laughter. Margaret Cole's birthday had been a grand success. Crystal chandeliers, toasts that sparkled with rehearsed charm, and a mother's satisfied smile as she watched her son finally appear, civilized, softened, human. But as they left the estate, the sky began to turn. Clouds rolled in over Connecticut like a warning. The air felt too still, too heavy. Charlotte glanced out the window as Ethan drove, the rain starting slow, uncertain, before thickening into a downpour that swallowed the road ahead. Headlights smeared across the windshield like ghosts. Neither of them spoke for a while. The wipers swished in steady rhythm. The hum of the tires over wet pavement was the only sound between them. "You were quiet tonight," Ethan said finally. His voice was low, almost lost under the rain. "So were you," she replied. He gave a faint smile. "My mother can be a lot." "She loves you," Charlotte said. He kept his eyes on the road. "She loves what I used to be." "Before I learned how to stop bleeding in public." Charlotte turned to him, studying the hard lines of his profile illuminated by the dashboard light. "Maybe she sees what's coming back." He didn't answer. The silence between them shifted, no longer comfortable, but charged, fragile, alive. Outside, thunder cracked. The rain came harder. They hit the intersection just as the light turned green. Charlotte barely saw it happen. A blur of red lights to their left, a screech of tires, the flash of a truck breaking through the darkness. "Ethan!" she gasped. He reacted instantly. The tires screamed as he swerved hard, one arm flinging out in front of her instinctively. Metal shuddered, rubber burned against the slick road, and for a heartbeat, the car spun into a curtain of rain and fear. Then stillness. The engine sputtered, then died. The world shrank to the drum of rain on the roof and the sound of both their breathing ragged, uneven, real. Ethan's arm was still across her chest, holding her in place. His other hand gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "Are you hurt?" His voice trembled, barely audible. Charlotte blinked, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. "No." I don't think so." He turned to her, eyes scanning her face as if checking for damage, for proof she was still here. His hand cupped the side of her neck almost without thought, the heat of his palm grounding her back into the moment. "You're shaking," he said. "So are you." He looked down. His hand was trembling against her skin. He withdrew it, flexed his fingers once, then exhaled a long, shaky breath. "Damn it," he whispered, voice breaking for the first time since she'd known him. "I almost—" "Hey." Charlotte reached out, touching his wrist gently. "You didn't—" "We're fine." The street outside was deserted, rain cascading over the windshield, softening the harsh glare of passing headlights. Ethan laughed once, a hollow, disbelieving sound. "You call this fine?" "Yes," she said, still breathless. "Because we're alive." Their eyes met, and something inside him cracked open completely. For months, he had stood on the edge of emotion, refusing to fall. But now, staring at her wet hair clinging to her cheek, chest rising with shallow breaths, eyes wide and steady, he felt every wall crumble. He reached for her before he could stop himself. It wasn't a kiss born of heat or hunger. It was instinct, raw, human, desperate. His hand slid to her jaw, thumb trembling as he brushed away the rain from her skin, and then his lips found hers. The world disappeared. No thunder, no fear, just the press of warmth in the cold car, the rain surrounding them like a heartbeat. Charlotte didn't move at first. Shock rooted her to the seat. Then slowly, she leaned into it, not out of expectation, but recognition. The kiss wasn't perfect. It was clumsy, shaky, almost startled, but it was real. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, the air between them charged with something fragile and alive. Ethan's forehead rested against hers, eyes closed. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I shouldn't have." She shook her head. "Don't apologize." He looked at her, truly looked, and for once, there was no armor left. "I thought I'd lost you before I even had the right to care." Charlotte's heart stuttered. The words slipped out before she could stop them. "You do care." His silence was the only confirmation she needed. Outside, the rain softened into mist. The car's windows fogged, the air thick with the scent of damp fabric and adrenaline. Charlotte leaned back in her seat, trying to steady her heartbeat. She should have felt fear of the accident, of what they'd just done, of what it meant. But all she felt was stillness, a strange peace blooming in the chaos. "I should feel fear," she thought. "Instead, I feel found." The realization struck her with quiet certainty. She wasn't lost in this arrangement anymore. Somewhere between the silence and the storm, she had found something connection, maybe even love in a place she never expected to. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, staring out the window. "We should wait for the rain to ease up," he said. His voice was rough, unsteady. Charlotte nodded, her fingers still resting on the imprint of his touch against her cheek. He turned to her again, a hint of disbelief still lingering in his expression. "You really aren't afraid, are you?" She smiled faintly. "Not of you." He exhaled a laugh, soft. "Broken? That might be your biggest mistake." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe it's the only thing that's ever felt right." Their eyes met once more, and the world outside ceased to matter. When they finally drove home, the roads glistened under the streetlights, rainwater pooling in silver streaks. Ethan's hand still trembled faintly on the steering wheel, but Charlotte's hand rested quietly over his. He didn't pull away, neither spoke. There was nothing left to explain. The near crash had shattered something in both of them, the illusion that they could keep this arrangement purely transactional. And in its place, something new began to form, unsteady, undeniable, alive. Morning came quietly, diffused through pale clouds that muted the city's usual shine. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the wet shimmer of the streets below. Inside the penthouse, everything was still except for Ethan. He was already awake, standing in the kitchen in a plain gray t-shirt, hands wrapped around a mug of untouched coffee. The smell of rain still clung to the air. Charlotte emerged from the hallway, wearing a soft sweater and jeans. She looked better, color back in her cheeks, though her eyes carried the remnants of last night's adrenaline. "You didn't go to work," she said quietly. He shook his head. "I cleared my schedule." She blinked, surprised. "You clear your schedule?" He gave a half smile. "Apparently. I needed to remember what silence sounds like when it's not empty." There was something in his tone of fragile honesty that made her pulse quicken. She took a seat at the counter, waiting. Ethan set down his mug and turned to face her. "Charlotte, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say a word." She nodded, hands clasped in her lap. He exhaled. "I've spent years convincing myself that what I do, what I've built defines who I am, that if I worked hard enough, earned enough, no one could ever take anything from me again." His gaze drifted toward the city outside. "I told myself it was control, but it was denial. I wasn't building a life. I was hiding from one." Charlotte's throat tightened. She didn't move, afraid even a breath might break the moment. Ethan looked back at her, eyes unguarded for the first time. "I told you this arrangement was about appearances, stability. It was supposed to be simple, but it hasn't been. Not for a long time." He turned away suddenly, walking down the hall. Charlotte followed, her bare feet soundless on the floor. When she reached the doorway of his office, he was at the shelf near his desk, pulling open a drawer. From inside, he took out a thick, white folder, the marriage contract she'd signed months ago. Her heart stuttered. "Ethan, what are you doing?" He didn't answer. He carried the folder into the kitchen, setting it on the counter. The air between them felt electric, charged with something inevitable. "Ethan," she said again, barely above a whisper. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver lighter. The sound of it clicking open echoed in the stillness. Her breath caught. No. He met her eyes. Steady. Yes. The flame flickered to life, small but certain. He held it to the corner of the contract. The paper caught quickly, curling black at the edges. He dropped it into the stainless steel sink, the fire reflecting in his eyes. They watched in silence as the pages folded in on themselves, ink blurring, edges turning to ash. Charlotte felt tears spill over before she realized she was crying. "You're ending it," she said, her voice breaking. "You're setting me free." The words hurt more than she expected. Somewhere deep inside, she'd known this moment would come, but knowing didn't make it easier to bear. Ethan turned off the lighter and set it aside. Smoke curled upward, ghostly and gray. He looked at her then, and what she saw in his face wasn't detachment. It was release. "No. Charlotte," he said softly, "I'm setting myself free." She blinked, confused. From what? From fear, from pretending I don't feel anything, from thinking I can live behind rules and contracts. He took a step closer, his voice steady but low. "I told myself this was a transaction, but you turned it into something real, and I can't go back to pretending it isn't." Her tears fell harder now, silent and relentless. "You don't have to say this just because of last night. I'm saying it because of every night," he said. "Every morning, every time I walk into a room and feel it change because you're in it." He reached into the sink, stirring the ashes with a spoon until only black dust remained. "That contract was my cage, Charlotte. I made it to keep things controlled, to make sure no one could touch me again. But you already did." The tremor in his voice broke something inside her. She moved closer, her hand trembling as she reached for him. "And what happens now?" He looked down at her, eyes warm but uncertain. "Now we stop pretending this is about debt or duty or appearances. Ethan, I don't know what this becomes," he admitted. "I just know I don't want to build a life out of fear anymore." "Not with you standing here." They stood side by side, the last wisps of smoke fading into the air. Outside, sunlight finally broke through the clouds, reflecting across the glass walls and washing the kitchen in gold. Charlotte wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, still struggling to find her voice. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," he replied. "It was never about the contract. It was about me being too afraid to let something real exist without a signature attached." She gave a small, tearful laugh. "You realize this is the least businesslike decision you've ever made?" He smiled faintly. "And probably the only one that matters." The weight of his words sank in slowly. Charlotte took a step forward, her voice trembling but sure. "Ethan, you're free now. You can walk away. No explanations needed. But if you stay—" "I'm not walking away," he said before she could finish. Not this time. For a long moment, neither spoke. The city hummed quietly below them, a distant heartbeat against the stillness of the room. Ethan reached for her hand, hesitant, almost unsure. When their fingers touched, she felt warmth flood through her like sunlight. After too long in the cold, he exhaled softly. "You know, for years I thought strength was about control, but standing here, I think it's about surrender." Charlotte smiled through her tears. "Then maybe we're both stronger than we thought." They stood together by the sink, the ashes of their agreement lying between them, black dust marking the end of everything false and the fragile beginning of something true. Ethan brushed his thumb over her knuckles, his voice barely a whisper. "No more contracts, no more pretending." She nodded. "Only choices." He smiled faintly. "Then I choose this." As the morning light poured through the glass, the smoke finally cleared, and for the first time since she had entered his life, Ethan Cole looked like a man who had found peace not because he had control, but because he had finally let go. The smell of smoke lingered faintly in the air, though the ashes in the sink had long gone cold. Charlotte stood beside the window, arms wrapped around herself, watching the city blur beneath soft daylight. She could still hear his words echoing. "I'm setting myself free." It should have brought peace. It should have closed the chapter neatly, professionally, the way Ethan Cole lived his life. But peace wasn't what she felt. What she felt was everything at once: confusion, longing, fear, and something dangerously close to hope. Behind her, Ethan moved quietly. She heard the low hum of the faucet, the soft clink of ceramic as he washed the coffee cup. The sound was too ordinary for what had just happened. Finally, she turned. "So, that's it." He looked up, startled. "What do you mean? The contract's gone. The deal's over. So, what am I now?" "Ethan," her voice trembled, sharp edges cutting through the calm. "An obligation fulfilled. A lesson learned." He froze, the question landing heavier than either expected. "No," he said quickly. "That's not Charlotte. I didn't mean—" "Then what did you mean?" she pressed, stepping closer. "You can't burn a life we built even if it was fake, and not tell me what comes next." He set the mug down, hard. "I didn't plan this. All right, none of it. I'm trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense." Her eyes glistened. "I don't need sense. I need truth." The air went still. Ethan raked a hand through his hair, the composure he'd built cracking around the edges. "You think I haven't been trying. You walk into my life into this, and suddenly everything I swore I didn't need is standing in front of me." She blinked, stunned by the rawness in his tone. He took a step forward. "I burned that contract because I realized it was the last lie I was living. But I don't know how to do this, how to be this." Charlotte's voice softened, almost breaking. "Then tell me what you do know." He hesitated, jaw tight. "I know I can't let you walk away." Her heart stuttered. "You don't get to decide that." He exhaled, voice trembling. "Maybe not, but I can ask you to stay." She shook her head, tears spilling now. "Ethan, I don't belong in this world of yours. I never did." He crossed the room before she could take another step. "Don't you dare say that." "Why not?" she whispered. "It's true." "No," he said, his hand reaching out, fingers brushing her wrist. "You belong wherever you choose to be, and right now, you're here." Charlotte swallowed hard. "Ethan, don't leave." His voice was low, almost pleading. "Please." For a long moment, they stood motionless, inches apart. The space between them thrummed with everything unspoken: weeks of restraint, confusion, denial, and now, truth breaking through like sunlight after a storm. Charlotte tried to breathe, but the air felt too thick. Her pulse raced. "If we do this," she whispered, "it can't be halfway. It can't be another arrangement or illusion. I know. It has to be real." Ethan's eyes darkened, his voice steady but reverent. "Then it's real." She shook her head faintly, almost afraid to believe it. "Say it again." He stepped closer until their breaths mingled, his words a whisper against her skin. "For real. Starting now." Their lips met. Not with the shock of discovery like the night of the crash, but with the quiet certainty of a vow. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. It was trembling, human, alive. Ethan's hands framed her face as if he were afraid she might vanish. Charlotte's fingers gripped the fabric of his shirt, anchoring herself in the moment. The kiss deepened, slow and aching, every second erasing a little more of the distance they'd built. When they finally broke apart, the world seemed impossibly still. Charlotte rested her forehead against his chest, breathing hard. "You're shaking," she murmured. "So are you." His laugh was unsteady, but his arms tightened around her. "Guess we're both out of practice. Maybe we're just beginning." He brushed his thumb across her cheek, catching the trace of a tear. "You cried when I burned that contract," he said softly. She smiled faintly. "I thought you were letting me go." "I was," he admitted, "just not the way you thought." Charlotte looked up at him, searching his face for hesitation and finding none. "So what now?" Ethan drew a long breath. "Now, we stop pretending this is temporary." He took her hand, lifting it to his lips. You asked me once why I build walls. Maybe because I never had someone worth tearing them down for. Her eyes shimmered. And now, he smiled, small but certain. Now. They're gone. They spent the rest of the morning in quiet conversation, sitting side by side on the couch, the city slowly waking around them. For the first time, there were no rules, no lines they couldn't cross. He asked her about her favorite books, her father's recovery, her dreams beyond survival. She asked him about his childhood, the first time he failed, the last time he felt proud. With every answer, they began to rebuild not the arrangement they had signed, but the trust they'd never dared to imagine. At one point, Charlotte turned to him, a small smile ghosting her lips. "Do you realize this is the first day that feels like ours?" He nodded. "Then let's make it count." Later, as the afternoon light shifted golden across the penthouse, Charlotte caught her reflection in the window. The woman staring back wasn't the frightened girl who had sold a year of her life to save her father. She was someone new, still uncertain, still afraid, but no longer pretending she didn't belong. Behind her, Ethan approached quietly, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She smiled at the reflection of them, together, no contracts, no conditions. That maybe the real beginning doesn't come with signatures. It comes with choice. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Then, we've finally started." Charlotte turned in his arms, looking up at him. "For real?" Ethan's reply was a whisper that brushed against her lips. "For real, starting now." The weeks that followed felt like waking from a long sleep. The penthouse, once sterile, polished, and silent, had begun to breathe again. It started with small things. Charlotte's laughter echoing down the hall, Ethan's shoes kicked off by the couch instead of lined neatly by the door, 2 mugs instead of 1 left by the coffee machine in the morning. It wasn't perfection. It was human, and that was new. Some evenings they cooked together, though together might have been generous at first. Charlotte diced vegetables with quiet focus, while Ethan hovered like a rookie chef, trying not to burn garlic. She teased him gently. "You run multi-million-dollar companies, but can't handle a frying pan." He shot her a look over his shoulder. "I delegate," he said, deadpan. "You mean you order takeout?" Ethan smirked. Semantics. Their laughter came easier each night, the rhythm of it grounding them in something real. When he leaned over to taste the sauce, Charlotte swatted his hand away. "Wait, it's not ready." He ignored her and dipped his spoon in anyway. The look on his face made her laugh until she cried. "Too much salt?" she asked between giggles. He coughed dramatically. "I think I just swallowed the Atlantic Ocean." That was the first time Charlotte heard him laugh, not the practice kind he gave to investors, but the raw, unguarded laugh of a man rediscovering joy. Saturdays were hers. Ethan started showing up at the little Brooklyn bookstore, where she still worked part-time. Despite his protests that she didn't need to anymore, he'd pretend to browse while secretly just watching her talk to customers. Once, she caught him at it. "You're terrible at pretending to be a stranger," she said. "I'm not pretending," he replied. "I just like watching you belong somewhere." Sometimes, after closing, they'd walk through Prospect Park, the city glowing behind them. She told him stories about the regulars, the old man who only bought war novels, the little girl who came in every week for fairy tales. Ethan listened like he was learning a language he'd forgotten. And maybe he was. Then came the first road trip. Just a weekend upstate, away from boardrooms and meetings. They stayed in a small cabin near a lake, surrounded by pines that whispered secrets in the wind. Charlotte woke early one morning and found him outside, sitting on the porch steps with coffee in hand, barefoot, hair messy. It startled her to see him like that, unarmored. "You look different here," she said, stepping beside him. He smiled, eyes soft. "You mean human, I mean happy." He took her hand, fingers brushing lightly. I'd forgotten what that felt like. But happiness, fragile as it was, had to contend with the world beyond their small bubble. Reality began to intrude again, first as whispers, then headlines. Ethan's company, Coal Industries, was under fire. A joint project with a foreign partner had come under ethical scrutiny. Environmental violations, exploited workers, things he hadn't known about, or perhaps hadn't wanted to look too closely at before. The board demanded silence, damage control, profit first. But Charlotte saw the storm building behind his eyes long before he spoke of it. One night, she found him standing in his office, lights off, staring out at the skyline. The phone on his desk buzzed again and again, calls from partners, investors, the press. He didn't move to answer it. "You should pick up," she said quietly. He shook his head. "They don't want answers. They want denials." She stepped closer. "Then tell them the truth." His laugh was hollow. "You think that's how this world works?" Charlotte crossed her arms, meeting his gaze. "It's how you should work. The man I know doesn't hide from what's right." He turned away sharply, his jaw tight. "You don't understand. If I take the blame, I lose everything." She didn't flinch. "Then maybe it's time to decide what everything really is." Her words cut deep, because they weren't cruel. They were honest. That night, sleep refused to come. Ethan lay awake, the ceiling above him a blur of shadow and thought. Charlotte's breathing beside him was soft, steady, a comfort he didn't deserve but couldn't live without. Can I be the man she believes I am? The question twisted inside him. He'd spent years defining strength as control, power, untouchability. But she'd shown him something else. Strength as vulnerability, integrity, courage to lose. The next morning, he drove to his office alone. By evening, the news had broken. Coal Industries to withdraw from disputed project. The headlines read, "CEO rejects board's proposal, prioritizes ethical reform." The stock dipped. Investors panicked, but Ethan didn't flinch. When he returned home, Charlotte was waiting by the window. He looked exhausted but lighter somehow. "I think I just set fire to my career," he said quietly. She smiled through tears. "Then maybe you've finally built something real." He stepped forward, brushing a stray hair from her face. "You were right, about everything that matters." That night, as they cooked together again, the air smelled like garlic and redemption. Charlotte tasted the sauce and smiled. Still too much salt. Ethan laughed softly, reaching for her hand. "Some habits die hard. Some are worth keeping," she replied. He leaned in, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "You make me want to be better." Charlotte met his gaze, steady and sure. "You already are." The fall didn't come with thunder or flames. It came quietly through headlines, whispers, and the slow unraveling of everything Ethan Cole had built. At first, it was just numbers, stocks dipping, investors retreating, meetings that once felt powerful, now heavy with unspoken judgment. But then came the real blow, the board's announcement that a crucial contract, worth hundreds of millions, had been withdrawn. Coal Industries no longer considered a reliable partner. The reports read, the financial loss was catastrophic. The personal humiliation, worse. Ethan sat in his office, watching his name scroll across the financial networks. Every word felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. He had chosen integrity, and the world had chosen to crucify him for it. By evening, the media had turned their attention toward the softer target, her, Charlotte Hale, the bookstore wife. They called her a distraction, a liability, a charity case. Photos appeared online, her walking to work, her simple clothes, her modest smile twisted into captions that dripped with mockery. From paperbacks to Penthouse, the fairy tale that cost millions. She read the first few lines of one article before closing her laptop. The words stung, but not as much as knowing Ethan would blame himself for them. When he came home that night, she saw the defeat in his eyes before he spoke. "They're saying things about you," he began, voice tight. "I know, I'll handle it." "No," she said firmly. "You won't." Ethan froze. "Charlotte, I'm not going to hide because people can't understand what we are." She stepped closer, eyes fierce with quiet resolve. If I stay silent, I become the lie they're selling. He tried to protest, but she shook her head. You fought for what was right. Let me do the same. The next morning, she dressed simply a soft cream blouse, a knee-length skirt, nothing extravagant. The press had gathered outside the building, lenses ready, waiting for the fragile wife to crumble. Instead, Charlotte walked out with calm grace, head high, microphones pushed toward her, voices overlapped. Mrs. Cole, how does it feel to be blamed for your husband's downfall? Are you staying with him out of guilt? Did you marry for money? She paused at the top of the steps, the city's hum dimming beneath the chaotic noise. Then, she looked directly at the cameras. My name is Charlotte Hale Cole, she said, her voice steady but gentle. And no one ruins a man by asking him to do the right thing. The crowd went still. She took a breath, the wind catching strands of her hair. I grew up in a town where people worked hard and owned little. I know what it means to struggle to lose, to fight for a small piece of dignity. So, let me make something clear. Her gaze swept over the sea of faces. Dignity isn't for sale, not mine, not my husband's. You can't buy it, and you can't take it away. A beat of silence followed, thick and electric. Then, slowly, she turned and walked toward the waiting car, not hurried, not shaken, just composed a woman who had nothing left to prove. Ethan watched the live broadcast from his office. He hadn't breathed the entire time. When the camera caught Charlotte walking away, calm and radiant in her quiet defiance, something inside him shifted. He'd spent years believing strength was measured in power, wealth, control. But watching her, he saw what he had lost, the kind of courage that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. He turned off the screen, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like he was falling. He felt lighter. That evening, when Charlotte returned home, he was waiting by the window. No suit, no mask, just Ethan, tired, humbled, human. I saw you, he said quietly. She smiled, setting down her bag. I figured you would. He walked toward her, slow, deliberate. You didn't just speak for me. You reminded me who I wanted to be. Charlotte tilted her head. You already were that man. You just needed to remember. He reached out, brushing his thumb against her jaw. You shouldn't have had to defend me. I wasn't defending you, she said softly. I was defending us. Ethan's voice cracked. You amaze me. I'm not amazing, she whispered. I'm just not ashamed. He smiled faintly. Maybe that's what amazes me. Over the next few weeks, the noise began to fade. The headlines moved on. The tabloids found new scandals. But something had changed, something irreversible. Coal Industries didn't recover its full market value. Not immediately, but the tide began to turn. Public opinion softened. Articles emerged about the CEO who chose conscience over cash. Ethan was no longer the ruthless mogul. He had become something rarer, an honest man. And beside him, Charlotte remained unshaken. When he returned to the penthouse late one night, he found her asleep on the couch, a book open on her lap. The lamplight fell softly across her face. He stood there for a long time, watching her breathe, the quiet strength in her every motion. This, he thought, is what surviving with integrity looks like. He knelt beside her, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. She stirred slightly, eyes fluttering open. Hey, she whispered. You're home. Yeah, he said softly. Home. She smiled sleepily. How was the world today? He chuckled, loud, but I think it's learning to listen. Charlotte reached up, fingers grazing his. Then it was a good day. Ethan nodded, the best one in a while. 3 months later, winter had returned quiet, white, and forgiving. Vermont was blanketed in snow, the kind that softened every sound, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Charlotte stepped out of the car, her boots sinking into the fresh powder. The air smelled of pine and cold, of beginnings. Ethan stood beside her, his breath visible in the chill, his gloved hand brushing hers as he said softly, Almost there. She looked ahead and froze. At the edge of the clearing stood a small chapel, wooden, simple, timeless. Candles glowed from within, flickering against the stained glass. And through the open doors, she saw familiar faces, her parents, Margaret Cole, even Mrs. Lang, smiling gently in the corner. Charlotte turned to Ethan, heart racing. "What is this?" He smiled. That quiet kind of smile she'd learned meant he was nervous. "Come inside. I have something to show you." The warmth of the chapel wrapped around her like a memory. Snow fell silently outside the tall windows as the organ hummed a soft tune. Her father's eyes were wet, her mother's hand trembling in his. Margaret looked proud, maybe for the first time without reservation. And at the front, by the altar, a single folder rested on the table. Charlotte's steps slowed. "Ethan." He picked it up carefully and held it out to her. "Do you recognize this?" She blinked, eyes widening as she read the header. "Divorce papers." Her voice caught. "You're ending it." Ethan nodded once. "Yes, but not for the reason you think." He took a breath, his words deliberate, everyone steady as the heartbeat beneath them. "When we married, it was on paper, a contract, a transaction. You gave up your freedom to save your family, and I gave up my soul to protect an image." He met her eyes, unwavering. "I can't live with that being the foundation of what we've become." Charlotte's throat tightened. "Ethan, I want to undo the old," he said softly, "so you can choose me freely, not because of obligation, not because of debt, but because you want to." The chapel was silent except for the faint crackle of candles. Ethan placed the folder back on the table and turned to her. Reaching into his coat pocket, from it, he pulled out a small velvet box, not black and perfect like the first one, but deep blue, edges slightly worn, as if it had been carried for weeks waiting for courage. He opened it. Inside, the ring was simple, a thin band of gold, a single diamond set low, modest and real. He took a step closer. "Charlotte Hale Cole," he said, voice breaking slightly on her name. "I want to marry you, not for business, not for image, just because you're my home." Long pause, heartbeat sound. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his face until he was just light and warmth and sound. "You don't need to do this," she whispered. "We're all ready." He shook his head gently. "No, we were surviving. I want to live with you, build something that doesn't start with signatures and conditions." He went down on one knee, the old wooden floor creaking beneath him. "Charlotte, I've spent years learning how to build empires. You taught me how to build a life. Will you choose me again?" Her hands trembled as she covered her mouth, laughter and tears colliding in the same breath. Around them, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, the flicker of candles, the muffled wind against the chapel walls, the weight of a love that had survived too much to ever be ordinary. She knelt too, her knees touching his in the snow-dusted aisle. "You're such a fool," she whispered, tears spilling freely. He smiled through his own. "I've been told." "Yes," she said softly, voice trembling with joy. "Yes, I'll marry you." The words felt like release, like absolution. Ethan exhaled, relief flooding his face as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It wasn't perfect, it was slightly loose, her hands cold from the winter air, but it fit in every way that mattered. Outside, the chapel doors opened, and the snow began to fall heavier, soft, endless, like the sky itself was blessing them. Their family stepped forward, laughter mingling with tears. Margaret hugged her son tight, whispering something that made him smile through his tears. Charlotte's father shook Ethan's hand, his eyes bright with pride. No cameras, no contracts, no spotlight, just love raw, quiet, and real. Ethan and Charlotte stood under the falling snow, their fingers intertwined. She looked up at him. "Do you realize this is where it started? A deal? A lie? And two people too afraid to feel?" He nodded. "And now it's just two people not afraid anymore." He leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers. "You once said dignity isn't for sale." She smiled. "Neither is love." He laughed softly. "Thank God." As the minister stepped forward and their families gathered close, the ceremony began, brief, simple, sacred. When the words husband and wife echoed through the wooden beams, Ethan kissed her with the reverence of a man who understood the cost of love and the miracle of being chosen twice. Outside, the snow fell harder, covering the old footprints, erasing the path that had brought them here, leaving only what came next. Later, when everyone had gone and the chapel lights dimmed, Charlotte and Ethan stood in the doorway watching the snow drift beneath the stars. "This time," she said softly, "we didn't sign anything." He slipped his arm around her waist. "No need. The only thing I'll ever need signed is your yes." She laughed quietly, resting her head against his shoulder. "That one's permanent." 5 years had passed since the snow fell like absolution. 5 years since that small Vermont chapel witnessed the simplest, truest yes either of them had ever spoken. The world had changed, but in all the right ways. Morning sunlight streamed through the wide front windows of Hale and Cole Books, the flagship store of their growing community chain. The smell of roasted coffee, old paper, and cedar shelves filled the air. Laughter drifted between aisles, mingling with the sound of pages turning and quiet conversation. At the center of it all stood Charlotte, her hair tucked loosely behind one ear, sleeves rolled as she unpacked a shipment of new titles. A little boy's voice interrupted her. "Mom, Mom," he stole my sticker. She turned, already smiling. "Theo, give it back to your brother." "I didn't steal it." "He gave it to me," the other twin shouted, indignant. Ethan appeared a second later, balancing a box of inventory in one arm and trying not to laugh. "We have a code red sticker situation." Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "You're supposed to be organizing the reading corner, not escalating the chaos." He grinned, setting the box down. "It's character development. They'll thank me someday." The boys groaned in unison. "Dad." Charlotte's laughter filled the shop, that warm, familiar sound Ethan swore could heal just about anything. After the twins wandered off to explore the picture books, Ethan moved beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "You know," he murmured, "I still can't believe this is our life." She smiled. "Believe it. It's messy, noisy, and perfect." He leaned against the counter, watching her hands move with practiced ease. "We've gone from boardrooms to bookstores. My 25-year-old self would have called that a downgrade." Her eyes sparkled. "And your 39-year-old self," he reached for her hand, "calls it peace." Hale and Cole. Books had grown far beyond that first Brooklyn shop. They had opened 6 locations across the East Coast, each one built with the same mission to make stories accessible to every hand that needed them. Children's reading programs, community events, free literacy workshops, all initiatives born from Charlotte's heart and fueled by Ethan's business acumen. For the first time, his ambition wasn't measured in revenue but in reach. He'd traded spreadsheets for story hours, suits for sweaters, quarterly reports for the sound of his son's laughter between the aisles. Sometimes, on quiet mornings before the store opened, he would stand in the middle of it, all the smell of ink and dust and life around him, and think, "This is what I was building for, all along." One afternoon, Margaret Cole visited the store for one of her charity meetings. She had aged gracefully, the kind of elegance that no longer demanded attention but invited it gently. Her organization, the Margaret Foundation, had become one of the most respected charities for single mothers in the state. She'd told Ethan once that it was Charlotte who inspired her. "Watching you," she said that day, resting a hand on Charlotte's shoulder, reminded me that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it reads bedtime stories and pays hospital bills. Charlotte squeezed her hand, touched beyond words. Margaret smiled. "Your boys are lucky. They'll grow up knowing that love isn't about contracts. It's about consistency." Ethan, standing nearby, caught his mother's gaze. The tension that once shadowed them was gone. What remained was pride and peace. Later that evening, after the store closed, Charlotte went upstairs to her small office. The twins were asleep in the reading nook, curled up under a blanket embroidered with cartoon moons. Ethan was downstairs locking up. The office lights were dim, the space lit mostly by the golden hue of the desk lamp. She sat down, flipping through tomorrow's scheduled supplier calls, author visits, community event proposals. Her eyes drifted to the wall beside her desk. There, framed in glass, hung a small square of paper burned at the edges, yellowed with time, the singed corner of their old marriage contract. Ethan had tried to throw it away years ago. Charlotte had stopped him. It's not a reminder of what we were, she'd told him. It's proof of what we became. Now, as she looked at it, her heart swelled. That fragment of ash and ink was the mark of two people who had once lived in fear and had chosen, every day since, to live in faith instead. She traced the glass with her fingers and whispered, "We did it. Downstairs." Ethan called up to her. "You're talking to the wall again, aren't you?" She laughed. "I'm talking to the past." He appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened, hair slightly mussed. "Tell it we're running late for dinner." She stood, moving toward him. "You ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't met that day?" He smiled. "All the time, and every time, I'd decide not to." Charlotte leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. "You're a good man, Ethan Cole." He chuckled softly. "Took a while to get there." "You were always there," she said. "You just had to burn your own map first." Outside, the city was settling into night. The storefront's neon sign glowed softly against the snow beginning to fall. Ethan locked the final door, then took her hand as they stepped out into the street. Their breath rose in white clouds. He looked around the world quieter, gentler than it had ever been. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "for a man who once thought love was a liability, I turned out pretty lucky." Charlotte smiled. "You didn't get lucky. Ethan, you got honest." He paused, looking at her like it was still the first time he'd ever seen her. "With you, it's the same thing." They laughed softly, the kind of laugh that carries years of shared mornings, arguments, and forgiveness. As they walked home, the snow fell just as it had 5 years ago, steady, silent, eternal. The evening air in Vermont was crisp, sweet with pine and the faint scent of wood smoke. The mountains stretched in the distance, violet under the soft descent of twilight. Charlotte sat on the wide porch of their cabin, a wool blanket draped across her legs. The old swing creaked beneath her, moving with the gentlest rhythm, as if time itself had slowed to listen. Ethan stepped outside carrying 2 mugs of chamomile tea. He set one beside her and eased into the seat next to hers. The boards groaned softly under his weight. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind played with the edge of the blanket, the sound of wind chimes from the eaves mingling with the hum of the forest. "Do you ever think," Charlotte said finally, her voice soft and distant, "how fast it all went?" Ethan smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "All the time, especially when the boys are quiet. That's when I realize how rare stillness has become." She leaned her head against him, feeling the slow, steady rise and fall of his breathing. "Sometimes I miss the chaos, even the mess." He chuckled. "Give it 5 minutes. They'll find a way to turn bedtime into a revolution." Charlotte laughed, the sound low and warm. "They take after you." He turned toward her, mock offense in his tone. "I'll pretend that was a compliment." Silence fell again, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the kind of peace they had earned one decision, one forgiveness, one day at a time. The porch light flickered on as dusk deepened. Fireflies began to glow across the yard, small sparks of gold in the gathering dark. Ethan stared at them for a long moment before saying quietly, "You know, I used to hate nights like this." Charlotte lifted her head slightly. Why, they were too quiet, too still. Back then, quiet meant loneliness. She smiled faintly. And now, he looked down at her, eyes soft. "Now it sounds like gratitude." Her heart swelled, the truth of it sinking deep. After a while, Charlotte pulled her blanket tighter, her tone shifting, introspective. Do you ever regret how it started? Ethan didn't answer right away. His thumb traced slow circles along her shoulder. Thoughtful. I used to, he admitted, for a long time. The contract, the lies, the fear. It all felt like a stain I couldn't wash off. But now, he exhaled, watching the stars blink into view. Now, I think it was the only way I could have learned what mattered. Charlotte nodded slowly. Pain as a teacher? Yeah. He smiled, faintly, a harsh one, but thorough. She looked out at the horizon, the last light of sunset painting the clouds in gold. You've changed, she whispered. Ethan turned to her. So have you. She tilted her head, curious. How you used to carry the world on your shoulders, he said. Now, you just carry what fits in your hands, and you smile while you do it. Charlotte felt her throat tighten. I think you taught me that. He shook his head gently. No, you taught yourself. I just got lucky enough to watch. They fell into silence again, the kind that didn't need filling. The wind picked up, cool and tender, stirring the chimes into a soft melody that danced through the air. After a long while, Charlotte spoke again, her voice quiet and even. When I was 24, I thought love was something you either found or didn't, that it just happened to people. But now I know it's a choice. Ethan listened, eyes on her face. Every morning, she continued, I wake up and choose it again. Even when we argue, even when we're tired or scared or lost, that's what love is. Ethan choosing it when it's not easy. He smiled, a small, humbled curve of his lips. Then, I guess we've been pretty consistent. She laughed softly. I guess we have. He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. You know, there's something I never told you about that day I burned the contract. Charlotte turned to him, curious. What I was terrified, not of losing the company, not even of losing control. I was afraid you'd walk away before I could tell you. I didn't want the contract, I wanted you. Her eyes softened. You've told me that 100 times since. Yeah, he said, but it still feels new every time I say it. She smiled, squeezing his hand. Good, because I still need to hear it. The porch light flickered again, and somewhere inside, one of the twins stirred a faint, sleepy murmur through the open window. Charlotte leaned into Ethan, her head resting on his shoulder once more. Do you ever think, she whispered, that maybe we were meant to save each other? He nodded slowly. I think that's exactly what happened. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and snow. A heartbeat of silence passed before Charlotte spoke again softly, almost like a prayer meant for the wind. Once, I sold my future to save someone I loved, but life gave me back something richer, the man who tore the paper and taught me what real love costs. Ethan looked down at her, eyes glistening with quiet awe. That's beautiful, he murmured. She smiled. It's true. He kissed the top of her head, his voice barely above a whisper. Then, let's keep choosing it. Charlotte nodded against his chest. Every day. The wind chimes swayed gently, their soft song carrying into the night as the scene faded into the sound of a slow, steady heartbeat. The rhythm of a love no longer borrowed, but built. At its heart, The Millionaire Who Tore the Contract is not just about love, it's about transformation. It reminds us that no matter how old we are, redemption is always possible, and it often begins the moment we stop trying to control life and start allowing ourselves to feel. Ethan's journey teaches us that success without compassion is an empty victory. True strength doesn't come from building walls, but from having the courage to let them fall. Charlotte shows us that dignity and kindness can turn even the most painful choices into paths toward healing. Many of us, especially as we grow older, learn that love is not the spark of youth. It's the quiet decision made every day to stay, to forgive, to build. This story is a gentle reminder you are never too late to begin again, to love deeper, or to rewrite the story you once thought was over. So, As you close this chapter, ask yourself what contracts in your own life are worth tearing up so you can finally live free with an open heart. Thank you, dear listeners, for staying with us through this journey of love, loss, and rediscovery. If Charlotte and Ethan's story touched your heart, remind yourself every ending can be rewritten when we choose compassion over pride. We hope their story brought you warmth, reflection, and a little faith in second chances. If you believe that real love still exists quiet, patient, and strong, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that shine a little more light into the world.